everybody, and welcome. I'm Heather Thomas, and I'm the head of development at the Green Party. I can see that people are slowly entering the Zoom room. So I'm just going to start by welcoming you and giving you a bit of an overview of tonight's event. Greetings from my home in Cambridge, and I mention that because tonight we are discussing the topic of how home is a green issue. So feel free to share and chat where you are tuning in from tonight. We usually span the breadth of the UK, and sometimes from further afield. So please do let us know where you're coming from. This conversation is the third part of a series in which we have been exploring how all issues are interconnected issues, particularly when we're talking about systems change. So we've had a conversation around how health is a green issue, how work is a green issue, and tonight we're going to be talking about how home is a green issue. The topic of systems change and how all issues are interconnected is a hot topic as of late. Of course, in a lot of the protests that we've all probably participated in and certainly been aware of in the media, the moniker, the mantra, systems change, not climate change, is one that's becoming quite popular, and rightly so. It seems that with certainly our economic system, we seem to have confused the mechanism of the system, money, for the goal of the system. And I think most of us would describe the goal of the system as being much more about equitable well-being for people and planet. And I suspect that if I were to ask many of you, what would you describe the meaning of life as being? Very few of you would probably say the accumulation of money. And I imagine more of you would say something along the lines of the connection to people in place, enabling everyone to have some sense of meaning and purpose, whether it's paid work or something else that you just love to do, an agency to make choices about those things. And of course, to ensure that all of that ability to thrive is underpinned by equitable access to basic security, housing, obviously, solid work, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those, I think, are much more of a formula for a dignified life, but our system is a bit flawed, it's a bit broken. And so what we're here to talk about tonight is how do we fix some of those design flaws to ensure that our system does provide a dignified life for everyone in our communities and our countries and the planet upon which we all depend. So how do we go about doing it? We suppose that there are two big things that need to be done. One is taking a much more systems thinking, holistic approach to designing policies and designing our solutions and our fixes. The difficulty is those holistic systems change solutions don't really fit all that easily into a soundbite. And certainly coming from somebody who helps working in communications for a political party, that's a challenge. So how do we get more people involved in conversations like this so we can talk well beyond just sound bites and get to the root of the matter and understand how everything is interconnected? But of course, it isn't just talking, it's doing, right? So how do we work together to find ways to collaborate, to make connections with different people in our communities, with different organizations, so that we can figure out solutions and we can go beyond thinking and we can go and move faster, more urgently towards the doing to help create the solutions that we need. So tonight we are going to have that conversation under the auspices of our theme, which is how home is a green issue. And we have collected what I think is a really exciting group of people. Some people who are working very practically on the housing crisis, and other people who are working more broadly in terms of the reimagining and how we connect and build more thriving communities, whether it's our next door neighbors and the neighborhood in which we live, or the biosphere that we all share. Now, of course, we're going to have a question and answer session tonight, and I'm going to ask all of you in the audience to use the Q&A function and to put your questions in the Q&A function. Please don't use the chat. It moves too quickly and we'll miss the questions. So if you put it in the Q&A function, that would be great. And a reminder that the Q&A function also has the opportunity to upvote. So if you haven't formed a question yourself, but you really like the question that somebody else has posed and you think, aha, I wish I had asked that, you can vote for that question. And so in a democratic fashion, we're going to be asking the panelists the questions that have had the most votes towards the end of the session. So without further ado, I will stop talking and start introducing the very interesting people who are the panelists who are joining us tonight. And I'm going to ask you all to just introduce yourself briefly and explain a little bit about how your work embraces this concept of how home is a green issue. I'd like to first introduce Tyrone Scott, who's one of our young green activists who stood as a candidate for us in Hackney and also works for Shelter. Welcome, Tyrone.
Hi, so yeah, pleasure to be here this evening. So yeah, my name is Tyrone Scott and I currently live in Hackney, and yeah, so I was the parliamentary candidate in Hackney in the last general election, but also have spent the last 18 months as the Young Greens campaigns officer, focusing on sort of campaigns around housing and housing rights issues. And then as Heather's also stated there, I have also spent the last 7 years working at Shelter, the national housing charity, in a number of different roles, from sort of frontline advice work to then moving into community organising and working within our campaigns. Whilst I have worked for Shelter for much time, I guess I'm here to express my personal opinion, not necessarily that of Shelter, but also I doubt they conflict too much. But yeah, I mean, the work that I have done has certainly been around home being a green issue, and home being around you know, equality and you know, challenging inequality around housing and access to housing, and then also looking in a more sort of clear and fundamental way that housing is a green issue, in the sense that we've been looking at you know, things around housing developments, how they are really quite impactful when it comes to the environment, or the environmental impact of, you know, redevelopments and a lot of these constructions that are going in, and working to really shine a bit more of a light onto that, and looking at alternative ways in which we can ensure that we meet our housing need without causing the ecological damage that can sometimes come with that as well.
Thanks so much, Tyrone. We're happy to have you tonight. Dr. Nancy Holmen, welcome. Dr. Nancy Holmen is the Associate Professor of Urban Planning in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, thank you very much. First, just Nancy, because the doctor part freaks me out. I'm the director of the planning program at the LSE, and my work really revolves around planning and sustainability, but also planning and housing. So I've done quite a bit of work recently on how the government is changing the discourse around planning, and in many respects, how that takes away local control. So I saw a question ziz by on the chat from Philip Allen, or a comment about, for example, garages being developed into housing without any kind of local control. And I think that is such a perfect issue for us to think about and discuss, because it's not the local planning department that is doing that, it's central government taking away local control from people. They remove any rights from local government to actually respond to people in a sustainable way. Clearly, these are the kind of dwellings and developments that aren't helpful to us and are kind of the antithesis about what we'll talk about today. So I'm really interested and very excited to kind of bring some of my research here, but also to hear what everyone else has to say.
Thanks, Nancy. We're thrilled that you could join us tonight. And then I'd like to introduce Tom Chance, who is the co-CEO of the Community Land Trust. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Heather. So I'm the Joint Chief Executive of the National Community Land Trust Network. We are a membership body and a charity for just over 300 community land trusts around England and Wales. They are set up by local residents to steward land and to develop housing and other assets for the well-being of the community. So the idea is they're democratic in that anybody who lives or works in the area they operate in can join and become a member, and they're governed in a one member, one vote basis. And then they take up assets and they do development. And so when it comes to housing, community land trusts have built about 1,000 homes and bought up and control and manage many others around the country. And what's interesting is how they then look at interconnected issues around environmental sustainability, social and economic sustainability in the housing market and the land markets, and aren't about giving communities a voice so much, or giving communities some consultative role, but actually communities being in the driving seat, saying what sort of homes do we need, what other assets do we need, and then making that happen.
Thank you, Tom. And then I'd like to introduce and welcome Mya-Rose Craig, who's joining us from Germany. Some of you might know Mya-Rose as Bird Girl on Instagram. And Mya-Rose is also the president and the instigator of a wonderful organization called Black to Nature. Welcome, Maya.
Hi, thank you for having me today. So yeah, like Heather said, I'm Maya, I'm 18, and I guess I would call myself an intersectional activist, and a lot of the work that I do is sort of that communication between a lot of ethnic minority communities and the environmental movement and the climate change movement, and figuring out how to make it really relevant and how to engage people who I guess aren't like the traditional suspects in green issues, because I think it's incredibly important to the sustainability of the movement. Yeah, and I'm really pleased to be here today just because I'm not a housing expert. I don't know all the ins and outs of all the policies and stuff. And I feel like I can have a really solid perspective of, you know, how the different communities feel about this issue and how we can go forward in communicating the importance of it for, you know, everyone, for the individuals.
Thanks, Maya. And last but definitely not least, I'd like to introduce Marcus Lichens, who's joining us from Los Angeles. And Marcus is a very innovative artist and activist who I worked with back at the Royal Academy of Arts a while ago, where he was helping us to imagine our atmosphere in a very tangible way ahead of the time of that being popular. So welcome, Marcus. It's nice to see you.
Thank you very much, Heather, and great to pick up the threads. My main interest is basically consciousness. And again, I'm not an expert, just like Mya-Rose, but I do feel like we can have some perspectives on how things are approached in different ways, and how we can sensitize ourselves to our surroundings and reimagine things completely differently. I work a lot with neuroscientists, as much as with architects, planners, urban planners, and all sorts of different professionals. So I'm almost like a hub that links all these things together.
That's brilliant, and it's the perfect segue. So let's jump into the meat of it. Tyrone, I'm gonna. Well, one thing I should say, and I don't think I did to the group, is that this whole group of people has met previously a couple of weeks ago to start planning this session and discussing what we wanted to say and how we did find connections through all of our disparate work. And so the first part of the evening, we're going to try to do a bit of an introduction and to help you understand the connections of those threads that we did find. And Tyrone, I'm going to pose the first question to you. When we met, you shared your perspective both as a Green Party activist and former candidate, as well as an employee of Shelter, about the politicization of the housing issue itself, and how that's kind of transitioned our understanding of housing as a human right into a mechanism for profit. And could you explain what you meant by that just a little bit more? And given that we are a political party, what is it we might be able to do to shift that political conversation back to housing, to home being a human right?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's it's a really good question, and in some ways it is a difficult one, because whilst you know, I do have concerns about housing becoming politicized, I guess there's always going to be an element of the fact that the provision of housing is always something that's going to be decided upon essentially by politicians and by, you know, laws and legislation that is passed through Parliament. So there's always going to be a nature of you know, politics involved within the provision of housing, and that's going to be sort of difficult to change. But I guess the sort of point I was alluding to in that really is how I think it's sort of become almost a political tool sometimes in the provision of housing, and sort of playing politics around housing just damages the actual increase in the provision and doesn't help solve the housing crisis at all. We often see you know, many different sort of fingers being pointed as to why we don't have the housing that we need to sort of, you know, supply the demand. And, you know, often we'll have you know, different layers of government, such as potentially central government, saying that there's, you know, obstructive planning systems in the way, and local governments and planning departments, you know, the planning departments will say, well, that's not the case at all. You know, we're struggling with, you know, funding from the central government, and all sorts of different reasons being given about. But what that does is just does not solve the housing crisis. It just then has become a bit of a tool that can get played with, you know, which doesn't really help with the discourse at all. And I don't think it's helps either that now the provision of housing and the different types of housing is, you know, there's looking at the increase of social or council housing, which is of course the more affordable type of housing that would help meet some of that demand, and then also the increase in that, you know, the private developments in the private rented sector. But it's seen that almost one side of the argument is seen as a socialism or socialist issue, and the other side is seen as more of a, you know, neoliberal kind of viewpoint. And as you know, both of those can be so conflicting and almost tribal at times. It does not help that, you know, one side may not then look into you know, working with the other side in looking to solve that, because they're so specifically sort of against each other. And I think another sort of big issue with that this is now is, because it is such a political issue, it only often gets addressed when it is high enough up the political agenda for the, you know, the politicians to understand that this is what the voters want, and this is what voters require and need, and therefore if they address this, they may then get the votes that they need, which is definitely not the discourse that you want around housing when it comes to solving the housing crisis. But I believe that's now where we are in the current state of things. So I guess if we look to try and address this issue, maybe one of the things is to try and find ways to drive you know, the need for housing and affordable housing up the political agenda. And it's difficult really to understand the best ways to do this, because, you know, it's very difficult, otherwise we'd be there already. But I think it's really beginning to find a way to address that this is an issue that transcends sort of party lines, especially when it comes down to the voters across the political spectrum anyway. You know, regardless of where you are across the political spectrum, there are people from those sides who are being affected by the lack of you know, adequate, affordable and secure housing for them, and this is something that I think, if that's highlighted as much more of an issue, rather than making it a left or right issue about, you know, one side, you know, wants more affordable housing and the other side doesn't. I think if we actually get down to the, you know, the people, then really both sides are suffering the consequences of the housing crisis right now. And it's a way of trying to bring that forward a little bit more, but obviously that is quite a difficult thing, or can be. And I think in ways to find solutions for that, I mean, there are no easy answers at all, but I think one of the things we can do is look at some of our neighbours in Europe. You know, when we look at the provision of housing in a lot of countries, from, you know, Germany, France, Belgium, you know, and the countries in Scandinavia, and Scandinavia, and often many of the countries in Europe too, they have much more access to affordable housing. And what's quite interesting, I think, here is when we look at affordable housing and the provision of more housing, we focus quite often, myself included, on social or council homes. But one of the reasons that we do that to such a degree is because the private rented sector now has become such a high cost, and the price points around that mean that we have to look at the alternative models with social and council housing. But again, when we do look at some of our neighbours in Europe and some of the ways they've sort of addressed their housing issues, it's not necessarily that they have, you know, increased no, they have, you know, incredibly high levels of social housing, but they also have more accessible, more affordable, and much longer term tenancies within their private sector housing market. Therefore, there's not that same reliance on sort of council or social housing, and therefore the state as well. So it's a bit of a difficult one, because of course there are many sides to it. But I think, you know, we really do have to address the lack of, you know, sort of social council housing, and what the reasons are for that, and what the barriers are politically for that as well. But there's also the second side to it, which is, you know, private rented sector housing is not necessarily a bad thing. I just think the way that we manage it currently, and some of the issues around tenancies and issues around cost, just make it seem like it's not a viable option. So I think we have to look at it in both ways really, and not just say that, you know, this sort of social housing is the only way to go. I think it's really fixing both sides and allowing both sides to sort of work together. But as I alluded to earlier, because it can sometimes get so tribal between the two different viewpoints, and often it's making it hard for us to get a solution really.
Thanks so much, Tyrone. I think that provides a really good segue to having a chat with Nancy. You mentioned votes and you mentioned the high cost of private home ownership. And Nancy, that brings me to a conversation that we had when we met about changing the focus of the conversation from housing to home, and how that's actually a big jump, that changes a bit of the social and the economic framing. And we ended up in a conversation quite a bit about democracy and how participation in democracy was underpinned by one's ability to own a home. And I'm wondering if you could explain this a little bit more, and how making a societal objective around creating homes for all might be able to change this story a bit.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so I'm really interested in how we talk about these issues because I think they shape what we do. And we did talk a little bit about this idea of local democracy and either home ownership or actually having a home, so housing versus home. And I think it's really important to understand that over the years, we've had a conservative party that has really promoted the idea, for better or worse, of a property owning democracy. And the idea behind that, by the time it got to Right to Buy and Thatcher and all of that, not to go back through lots of history, was the idea that if you own your home, you'll take care of it and you take more part in the community and therefore a better democratic citizen. And also that it offers you more opportunities in the market. If you don't like where you live, you can simply move, you're not locked in. The problem with this, and a huge problem with this, is it presupposes two sorts of things. The first is that it kind of makes people who are not homeowners into bad democratic citizens. You suddenly are thought of as somebody who's ephemeral, who moves from place to place and therefore doesn't have as much connectiveness to a neighborhood or to a local council. So actually your importance is diminished. It also really assumes that we all have a choice, that we all have a choice to buy, that we all have a choice, if we are fortunate enough to buy, to be able to move at a whim. And it doesn't take anything into consideration of the economic cost that might have and the opportunities that we may have as individuals. I don't want to be too negative about this because this kind of way that we talk about property owning democracy, or the need for us to own our housing as an investment, is in political terms relatively new, in terms of the fact that if you think about, I mean, some of the panelists won't remember Thatcher as a actual physical thing, but my age I do. You know, it hasn't been around that long that we've had to think of property as something that we need to own, that we need to invest in. It forms the largest part of our net worth for most people. But that discourse has been just with us for that amount of time. And I think it's really important, if we want to break down this tribalism, if we want to actually try to consider housing in terms of homes, in terms of people having places to live, as our European counterparts often do, then what we need to try to do is actually not think, to really change the discourse, to try to start talking about these things as actually renters are important, council tenants are important. They make a huge contribution to local neighborhoods. They make a huge contribution to local democracy. They can take care of their homes and their places as well as anyone else. That the home is somewhere where we live and it's not somewhere we invest. And we need to value the fact that housing is an important part of our lives, not for investment, but for living. And if we allow people those opportunities, then we actually create a fairer and more equitable society. But we really have to work on winning back the ground that housing is simply a market-based product. So, I mean, I am hopeful that we can do that. I honestly am. but I think that everybody needs to get behind the message and push.
That's great, Nancy, and it's a great segue. And I love that you're hopeful, and I think you should be hopeful, because the next question is going to be addressed to Tom. And of course, Tom, when we met, was giving some wonderful examples from his work where the ideas that you were just discussing have already been brought to life in communities. And so, Tom, I'm wondering if you could share with us some of those examples or that you had shared with us when we last met, around groups of people who were working together, not just to retrofit communities, but to design communities that people were more connected to one another and to the place in which they live, to enhance their overall well-being, reinforcing, as Nancy said, that housing is about living our lives, right? And also specifically, you spoke about a difference between localism and subsidiarity. And I don't want that to sound like jargon, because there were some really good points behind that. So I'm hoping you could give us some examples and then explain to us what you meant by subsidiarity as potentially being a key to drive this message home and to get more people active and engaged in creating homes that enhance everybody's well-being.
Sure, okay.
The hope question is on you, Tom. You have to make us all hopeful.
All of that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
I've been looking at some of the questions in the discussion and thinking about things like Peter talking about companies sitting on land, Caroline about housing people kind of not getting the bit between their teeth and trying to do something on sustainability, Alison asking about specific needs like refugees, Terry saying something I hear a lot around the country about when you see housing built, it's a larger estate of executive homes that are too expensive. In all these problems, one part of the solution is obviously looking at the planning system, at the financial system, tax system, the kind of rules and incentives that shape the way that the market works, and part of it is also about council housing. But communities have an incredible capacity to also bring something to this. And what I find really interesting when I go and talk to community land trusts, often I go thinking I'm going to be here to talk about a housing project, and they just start talking to me about everything to do with their village life or their estate they live on and the regeneration scheme they've been going through, and they have a very holistic way of connecting together all these things that I suppose the Green Party would like to see connected. So community land trusts, by putting control and ownership in the hands of communities and giving them a legal duty to well-being, gives them the opportunity to try to come up with a solution. Interestingly, in Scotland, they're far ahead of England and Wales in giving real power to communities to then buy land, especially if there's a negative impact on local well-being. So it's really interesting to look at see what they're doing in Scotland on land ownership. The examples, quickfire. The first one I thought was London Community Land Trust, where homes are being built in inner London that are described as affordable, but they are aimed at households where their income is £80,000, and you think, well, they're not the people who most need help. Mm-hmm. London CLT developed a form of home ownership where the prices are permanently pegged to local median incomes. So the people they're selling the homes to are people like mental health nurses and teachers and people who work in the local shops. And when they sell the home on, they can only sell it at a price that's again pegged to local incomes. So they're giving them some of the benefits of home ownership, but as a tenure that gives you security and the ability to build up a bit of equity, but not as a kind of speculative investment. Community land trusts are best known for providing different types of affordable housing, but they also do a lot of other things. So the CLT, one of the first ones I visited in Somerset, in a little village called Norton-sub-Hamden, they built some affordable homes. And when they were completing the development, their village shop went up for sale, and they decided, well, we're going to buy the village shop and we'll operate that as well. So they run the post office and the shop. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, they were able to ensure the shop stayed open with volunteers and also set up a system to deliver care packages to households in their village and neighbouring villages that were self-isolating, because they kind of built that infrastructure, that social infrastructure around owning assets and getting the income from running housing and the shop and so on. Some really go big and think about retrofitting their entire community. So there's another rural one in a village called Swaffham Prior in Cambridgeshire, where they had completed some homes and they were concerned about fuel poverty in their village, and also the fact that most of the homes were on oil. So pretty typical in the countryside, in the village, you have oil as your heating system, and they were concerned about climate change. So they have been developing a project to retrofit a district heating system to the entire village. They identified a building, a bit of land they could use, which they bought. They've done exploratory drilling with boreholes. It's basically a ground and air source heat pump system, powered by solar panels. They're now going through the planning process. They've had grants from government and the combined authority and the local council, and they are forging ahead with taking their entire village off of oil, off of the back of having done a housing project. So what I'm interested in is not this as an alternative to the kind of bigger systemic solutions, but as part of the picture, really giving communities the power to make these changes themselves. So this question about devolution and localism, I don't like the idea of localism, and the principle of subsidiarity has always been central to green thinking. And the idea is that you do things at the most appropriate local level. So you give control over the land and stewardship of the land to the local community, but asking every local community up and down the country to develop housing and manage housing and to drill boreholes and so on is quite a big ask. So in these examples, you have communities being able to partner with housing associations, with their council, with businesses that have the kind of, the ability, the financial muscle, the skills to deliver a lot of these projects, but ultimately controlled by the local community that ultimately own the land. And it's that principle of subsidiarity that I think we need to look at, rather than kind of pitting different levels against one another. It's asking, well, where does the power lie? Where does the control lie? And kind of where does the capacity lie? And bringing all these different things together.
That's helpful. Thank you so much, Tom. And that really builds on our next speaker, which is Mya-Rose. And Mya, when we spoke in a similar vein, you were saying that, just passing bills through Parliament isn't going to cut it to make change happen. And you were also talking about formulas that you've discovered in your own work, where maybe somewhat similarly or somewhat different from what Tom has been describing, has enabled change to actually start to happen. And I'm wondering if you could explain to the audience a bit more about the formula and some of the examples of how you've seen change happen, how you think it has to happen, or the things that need to happen beyond just passing bills through Parliament, but not saying that's not important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the original point that I was trying to make was the fact that quite often when we're trying to implement social or structural change, a lot of the campaign is focused towards passing those bills, pushing that political change, when a lot of the time that means very, very little if we don't also have the people on board, when they're not also invested in these issues. And I think a lot of people, green housing just isn't an issue that they're sold on, because they do have so much going on in their lives. A lot of people do really struggle with housing issues in general, and it just feels like it's way down on the list of priorities. And I think that something could be really effective in the conversation in the future is just sort of reframing a lot of the conversations, so it isn't just about the really material things like triple glazing or putting on that's those sort of very physical things, but more about well-being and creating these community spaces and just making places better, more livable, more pleasant for people, and just giving it a really holistic view. Because I do think, like how we were saying before about how green issues are really politicized, they're really tribalized, and a lot of people, like talking about environmental issues, that's immediately something that they're gonna turn away from, because for them it's something that's associated with privilege. And I think more and more we need to, like we're talking about today, it's really important to start that conversation around the links between class and poverty and housing and all that sort of thing, and also acknowledge the fact that even if we do get these bills passed through, even if we do manage to make political change, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to do anything. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be practiced in real life. And I just think because there is a history of it being seen as so expensive and so inessential, it just isn't seen worth it by a lot of communities. And I think in the future, really going for that bottom-up approach, really just going into these communities, talking to people, asking what they want, what their priorities are, and reframing the issue through that could make a massive difference in the way that people approach these issues and in their priorities in life. Because I really do think that if people gain that proper understanding that it's not just something that's good for the world around them and good for nature, but it's something that's going to benefit them and their family, it would make a massive difference in people's approaches to environmental issues, including green housing.
Thanks so much, Mya. And yes, developing that depth of understanding and creating the mindset shift is something that needs to happen quickly. And Marcus, I'm hoping that you could try to address this question a bit more. I mean, mindset shift needs to happen quickly, but good God, I mean, it takes time for minds to change. And it also, the theoretical requires tangible experiences as well. And we talked a little bit about the crisis of imagination, and we talked a lot about citizen action and how citizen action might actually be a way of addressing the crisis of imagination and making the intangible more tangible. And whilst that seems big and woolly, that maybe some of that is the key to actually making change happen faster. So I'm wondering, I know you had some specific ideas around that, and you've been working in that in different ways as an artist and an activist yourself, and I'm hoping you could share some of your thoughts on those themes.
Yes, well, as you mentioned before, I live in Los Angeles and we have a huge housing crisis here and about 60,000 homeless people. And so one of the questions has been, you know, how to integrate all these issues and problems and resolve them in some way. And one of the works I did when I arrived in LA was to develop a project that I called Making Yourself Home, as opposed to Making Yourself at Home, which was this idea of trying to kind of integrate some feelings of what a home is inside you, and use that as a kind of stepping stone to begin to build out, you know, physical needs. But I did notice one of the Q&As with Peter Cox was saying that this is not such a great format because basically we're talking all the time and we're not, you know, having a discussion with the audience. But one of the things I proposed the other day was that we could do some pop-up spaces in city centres around the UK and begin to discuss all these issues that we've all been talking about and listen and on the basis of something that's emergent, something that's from the ground up, from the community up, because I think often, you know, we hear a lot from, you know, planners and authorities that tell us how we're supposed to do things. So I think that's a super important thing to begin to kind of turn these things around and begin to listen, create that forum of listening. And I guess just the last thing, I mean, I've worked a lot with neuroscientists and also in therapeutic instances, such as helping stroke patients in clinics and things. And so this idea of healing is really important to me. And I think in that sense, we need a social healing, environmental healing, and a kind of more integrated approach to how we're approaching all these things.
Thanks, Marcus. And we are very quickly going to be turning over to the audience so that we can be having a bit more of a conversation. But I just want a very rapid fire as we're getting onto the topic of solutions to just turn back to Nancy, Tyrone, and Tom to get their input. Tyrone, when we met, you mentioned that even, you know, housing and homelessness NGOs might want to start shifting the narrative beyond we just need to build more housing quickly to these more broader conversations around how do we engage communities in problem solving for developing more homes where everyone can thrive and widening it to the community perspective. Why do you think that might be a good idea?
Yeah, sorry, I should have coughed just before then. But yeah, I mean, I think as I alluded to earlier, you know, for housing often to get taken seriously, you know, by politicians and those who can sort of make the decisions, it needs to be high up the political agenda. So it seems that's something that the voters want. So I believe that to do that, you know, the need for housing and the basically ask for more housing needs to essentially be more of a social movement, you know, for change. And to grow that social movement, I believe you have to engage your communities. So often some of the sort of campaign asks can be quite broad, you know, we need to build more social housing now, which is absolutely paramount and absolutely true. But does that get the person, you know, people in the community actively engaged and wanting to jump on board with that and create a social movement? And sometimes I think the answer is no. So one of the things that you can do to address that, and something that we have done at Shelter here, is look to change your strategies to become community-led when it comes to the campaigns and the policies that we design. So over the last 12 months, we've embarked on a community organizer program and employed community organizers in London, Bristol, Birmingham and Manchester at the start of what will hopefully be a wider expansion to really get into the communities who are being affected by the housing crisis and ask them and engage with them and get them to lead the campaigns that we're working on and help drive our policy for change, and therefore start to begin a bit more of a social movement. But I think as people have alluded to before on this call, I know Tom mentioned as well, it's about giving that power back to communities. And that's exactly, it's not just an issue for you know the governments to look at, large NGOs as well. We have a power, you know, as we are such sort of large institutions, and we have to recognize that the work that we do as well has to be community led and be a result of community engagement, but also really more importantly is about giving that power back to communities and giving them that agency to make them realize that they can make that change. So so it's probably been more than 2 minutes already, as I realize we're short for time, but yeah, community engagement, community organizing is the way forward, I believe.
That's great. Community engagement, community organizing. And Nancy, when we met, you used a phrase that I just loved, building dynamism around the small. What did you mean by that? Because I think that builds on what Tyrone was just saying.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that I think we could utilize a lot of the things that people are doing now around, for example, small makers units where people come together and they learn from each other about fixing their printer or fixing their bicycle or doing all of those things where you have really collaborative work. Citizen scientists. I have a former student who is working with school children and getting them to do air quality measurements so that they can motivate themselves to take different forms of transport. I think all of these sorts of things, these small little incremental activities build up to become much larger, because what you're doing the entire time is creating connections, and you're creating these moments where you can understand the importance of something. You can understand the importance of mobilizing around the environment. You can understand the importance of your water quality or your air quality, or indeed the quality of your housing. And also, by doing that, you can see what your neighbors have and what they don't have, and how you could, as a group, make those things better. So those small moments in spaces, like the idea Marcos was talking about pop-up spaces, these are hugely important to give communities some sort of forum in which they can come together and actually learn from one another, because that's the way you actually can make some sort of change.
As you were speaking, I was being reminded of what Marcus was talking about as well. So that was a nice connection.
It all does connect.
It all connects. And then Tom, just to drive down into a tiny bit more detail before we shift to audience questions, but you spoke about to make citizen power work, that we need a framework for flexibility, that clearly there aren't any one-size-fits-all solutions, which is what everyone's been talking about. And you mentioned some mechanisms like microfinancing, and I'm wondering if you can just explain a little bit more about what some of those mechanisms of a flexible framework might be.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I think actually, just looking at some of the discussion again, just thinking about the politics of this, there's been, for me, it's been interesting as somebody who's previously worked for Green Party politicians and stood as a Green Party candidate, but now leading a non-party political charity. You know, we're not aligned to any particular party, but there are quite a few currents in the Conservative Party at the moment, including some of the libertarian think tanks that have been mentioned in the chat, who support the kind of stuff actually that Tyrone was talking about, in the sense that they support community power, they support building things up from the bottom, they support the kind of little platoons in Burke's language. And obviously you can have problems with other beliefs they might have, and with also have what view they have of the role of the state. But the biggest impediment we find to our work is in a lack of support for the idea of citizens having any kind of agency, that whether left or right, most people in Britain in positions of power like to basically hold on to the power themselves. They think it's for the market or for the state to solve these problems, and they don't really believe in citizen power, don't really believe in that kind of radical devolution down to giving citizens the opportunity to be part of the solution. But there are quite a significant number of people in government at the moment who are supportive of this. In fact, it's even in the Conservative Party manifesto to support community housing, to give council estates greater control over how they run and so on. So for me, that's a kind of interesting thing to navigate as to how to try to direct some of that towards putting in place the kind of financial frameworks that respect local decision making rather than determining that national government knows what kind of affordable housing every community wants, and also then to get the private sector to kind of come behind that.
Thank you, and that's a great segue over to the Q&A from the audience. So let's dig into that a little bit more deeply. And the first question that has been upvoted the most is from Carol Broom, who says that she feels we need more council housing, not just affordable housing. Would you agree? And Tom, I think you started touching on that. I wonder if anybody, Nancy in particular, might you want to expand on what Tom was saying?
Well, I think absolutely. Certainly in places like London, we need more council housing because the measure by which we call something affordable is not affordable to most people. We have to, though, in order to do this, figure out a different way of paying for it, because currently we try to get Section 106 or we try to get SIL and we try to get it paid for out of the profit of development, which we absolutely should tax, and we absolutely should have something coming from that. But we also need to better prioritize how we spend our finances overall. And one of the things that we could do is build more council housing. And if we were to do that, we would greatly limit the problems we currently have with a housing crisis. But we have to make those political choices. Mm-hmm. And it's vital that we do. Otherwise, we're not going to get out of this problem. The other solutions that the government comes up with are things like permitted development, which doesn't give you any sort of contribution to affordable housing and produces, in some cases, houses in garages that have no windows. So you can go down that market choice of producing a lot of numbers very quickly with little control and no community say, that have no contribution to society, or you can say, no, that's not what we want to do. We actually want to invest our funding in council housing. Right. So yes, I would say that it is very important.
Thanks, Nancy. And the next question, I think, builds on the conversation that we were having at the beginning of the evening, talking about how housing has become politicized. I'm not going to say politicization again. And how do we move it away from being a mechanism for profit and addressing well-being issues? So the question is about what strategies could we adopt for addressing the issue of building contractors, land speculators sitting on land and not using it to build homes. So I think building on what Nancy was saying, it's about prioritizing. So what kind of strategies could we be adopting to help to reprioritize and to encourage people who own the land to use the land for social good? Tyrone, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I've just knocked my phone off the desk. That's a really, really good question. And it is something that is very difficult to get a simple answer to. But the issue of sort of sitting on land or land banking is definitely an issue which is large and is prevalent, because essentially land is being seen as, in many ways, as an investment piece, and unfortunately that is correct in the sense that it becomes more valuable over time. So it really is an issue that does need to be addressed. And I think it can be difficult. There's been talk about things around, higher taxation when it comes to the lack of use of the land that people do own. But the difficulty with this, I think, is that anybody who has the ability to sort of land bank, as it were, probably also has the ability to pay any increase in tax, at least unless it's incredibly high. But it's something that can be quite hard to address through taxation alone. Taxation is something that usually hits those who are lower on the income scale, and those who are land banking and have masses of land across the UK are not those who fall in that category. So taxation is not always the answer, although that can be a deterrent. I'm not sure it's going to solve the issue. So I think really it's more about sort of legislation and about laws around being able to do that, having to use land within a certain amount of time, and you know, having to use land in certain ways. And I think that again goes back to about public pressure, you know, and making it something that is on the political agenda and something that can be addressed. And the way to do that is again to sort of bring these issues to the people, let it become known at how prevalent this is, and then again making that part of the social movement for change, because I believe this is something that can only be sort of addressed by having laws around it not being an acceptable practice. Because yeah, it's hugely prevalent, it causes a big issue, but right now under the current system you can make money that way, and as we know, if people can make money that way, then somebody is there to make that money. So it's just a way of changing that system, but the system only changes really when it's public pressure, so we have to find ways to increase that pressure.
Thanks, Tyrone. And I think the next question I'm going to ask is from Caroline Duvier, and I'm going to address this, I think, to Marcus and to Maya. Caroline's doing her PhD work on sustainability and social housing. She's saying that housing people tell me that barriers to sustainability are mainly with government and policy. Politicians tell me that housing associations need to do more. The problem I see is that people are not connected and seem unwilling to work across their borders. What do you recommend can be done to get people to work better with one another, no matter which sector they work in? I think that gives you both an opportunity to maybe expand on some of your work. And Marcus, I think, did you want to go first?
Yeah, it's a good comment, and yeah, I agree completely that you know, until you change the mentality, you're not going to change the big structures behind them. So you know, I would encourage these kind of pop-up venues where people can give their input. There could be kind of polling. We could give questions and receive answers, and then create discussions, and then propagate this system, you know, both obviously in different environments, in the urban environment and in the rural environment. And then, you know, from that begin to kind of map out tendencies and desires and needs. And from that begin to kind of figure out a kind of roots up policy. And of course, if we can integrate any sustainable environmental approaches within all those systems, the better. There's so much better.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think this reflects, you know, a wider issue in the environmental movement, where a lot of the time there is a complete lack of cooperation from different, you know, different important bodies. And I think it is actually one of the large flaws where there's this absolute lack of cooperation. And I think going back to that idea of, you know, pushing for a more holistic viewpoint where we're coming at everything from different angles, I think it's increasingly important that we combat this kind of thing. But I think in general, there's a lot of issues just to do with, not just from people, but from the, you know, the people in charge, I suppose, of the complete lack of priority when it comes to green issues, which is part of the reason why there is that lack of cooperation in the first point, because it's not seen as important enough to come together to work on, compared to issues to do with, you know, welfare or health and safety and things like that. And I think that in going forward in the future, it's going to be really essential that environmental issues really and green issues really are seen as something that is a core value, that is really important for everyone that's getting involved in the project. But also, I suppose, finding the different ways to push for green change so that it isn't just relying on change that might not necessarily happen quick enough, but figuring out different loopholes. So, for example, I was talking to some local councillors and they were saying that the community infrastructure levy is really useful when it goes for encouraging people to make green change rather than paying what is essentially a tax. And you're not pushing it through bills, you're not pushing it through law. It's just motivating people to push forward. And I think we're going to need a lot more of that kind of thing in the future, where it really does just become a priority for people, to the point of cooperation.
Thanks, Maya. And building on that, Tom, I'm going to address the next question to you. There is a question from Alison Wood about, with green policy to welcome all refugees, how can we ensure we have enough suitable housing to meet their needs, and those of young people and the homeless quickly and happily. And I'm addressing it to you, Tom, because I think it was interesting what you were saying about the community that came together, and when they were undertaking their project ended up buying the local shop, and how that then became a mechanism to care for more people within their community. And I'm wondering if the answer sits somewhere in themes along those lines.
Yeah, I think it's sort of similar actually to what Mya-Rose was saying about valuing ecology and habitats for nature, is that, I mean, if you think about housing associations, some of them now are absolutely enormous, okay, and they have over 100,000 homes, and they're basically mainstream property developers. And a lot of those started in the front room of someone's house with a couple of people saying, we need to do something about homelessness in our local area. And they've just kind of grown out of all proportion, and their governance structures changed and so on. And there are now dozens, I was going to say hundreds, certainly dozens of community land trusts and cooperatives and other community organizations set up specifically to house refugees, set up specifically to address issues of systemic racism in housing, and other kind of, I see somebody mentioned gypsies and travellers, groups of people who for one reason or another are excluded from or discriminated against in the housing and land markets. And it's partly about having a kind of an infrastructure, a market infrastructure, where it's easier for groups to come together and solve their own housing situation, and or to be able to set up organizations to help others in their community, which is, community land trusts are largely about others in the community rather than looking after yourself. And also, so we're doing some specific work at the moment, funding a couple of people who've been involved in Black-led self-build groups to look into what are the systemic barriers to Black-led groups in doing community land trusts and other forms of community-led housing in England, and what specific things can we put in place to try to address those. I would love, one of my life's ambitions is that we'll finally do something similar on climate change and also on space for nature, just looking at those issues and how do you give people who do care about these things the opportunity to do it. The idea, I'm sure there are a lot of people in this country who don't care about refugees, as we see by the kind of newspaper coverage and so on, but there are an awful lot of people who do, and it wouldn't be that hard to give them the means to be able to start housing projects to meet those needs.
Thank you so much, Tom. It is 7 o'clock, everyone. So you have given us a generous hour of your time. The audience has shared a generous hour of their time. So I am going to wrap up this evening's conversation and say thank you so much to everybody for joining. I think that we have touched on a point that has been universal throughout all of these sessions, which is democracy isn't something that's done to you, but democracy is something that you do. And so how do we find more ways for people to understand the interconnections of issues and to create functionalities within our systems that enable people to just get on with it and to do the best that they possibly can do to find the solutions for themselves and create the communities in which they can thrive. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience that this event was recorded and we are going to be putting it up on the Green Living Room so that people can replay it and rewatch it and share it. And next week, we'll be live again, as we are every Wednesday at 6 o'clock. And we're going to be carrying on this conversation around how home is a green issue. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the economic side of it and talking to people who have started community businesses that are specifically focused on helping to create more thriving well-being communities. So thank you everyone once again for participating, and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.